What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Pondering Christianity. We are happy and psyched to be back here with Dr. Steve Miller. If you don't know Dr. Steve Miller, he wrote Near-Death Experiences as Evidence for God and Heaven and the Afterlife. So if you're not familiar with that book, you check out our last video where we interviewed Dr. Miller. I kind of show you the cover and all that good stuff. I'll also link the book in the description below. That being said, if you're new here, welcome to Pondering Christianity. We talk about Christian apologetic topics here, as well as near-death experiences, and soon, hopefully, deathbed visions as well. So that's where Dr. Miller comes into the conversation. If you haven't checked out the previous conversation, I will link it at the end of this video today. But for those of you who are kind of returning, I'm going to allow Dr. Steve Miller to explain a little bit more about himself. And we didn't get a chance to talk about his PhD dissertation last time, so we want to go on that today. But if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we're covering content like this all the time. And place your questions down below, guys, and we'll do the best we can to get to them in our next conversation. All right. Dr. Miller, go ahead and tell everybody hello and also let everybody know about your PhD dissertation.
Thanks. Hello to everybody. Thanks so much for having me on. I think these are interesting topics. When I teach Intro to Religious Studies, my students love talking about this stuff. Part of it is that they've had their own experiences within their families, people that they trust, and they like talking about it. They're very persuaded by these type things. So it's an exciting subject to cover. Yeah, you asked me about my academic background, and I failed to mention last time that I did finish up my PhD just recently, a couple of years ago, at Columbia International University, and my research was on deathbed visions. So when people are just about to die, like in a hospice unit from a long-term illness, they tend to start seeing people on the other side and very realistic visions, angels, sometimes Jesus, sometimes deceased relatives. And so I decided to go in and look historically at what research had been done on this, and how does that jibe with Scripture? Is that compatible or incompatible? Is this of the devil? Is it of God? So that's kind of what so now I'm turning that into a book. I started with about, I thought I'll find about 100 good resources on this, and it'll be a good niche topic for a PhD dissertation. When I got over 500 sources, I thought, oh my goodness, there's a huge amount of stuff, and now I'm up to like over 800, probably 900 sources.
Wow.
It's been studied a lot of great information there. So just like near-death experiences, this is kind of like a sister experience that happens before people really die. And children will just start talking about that they're not afraid to die, even though they hadn't been taught about these things that much or what to expect, or nobody's told them they're going to die. Because you don't come up to a child that's dying of cancer, like, oh, by the way, they're expecting you to die in the next few days. Mm-hmm. So they're not knowing this, and yet they'll say, oh, well, I know where I'm going. Jesus has shown me the other side, and I'm not afraid to go there, and Uncle so-and-so is there, and my dog's there, and so they just start talking about it. So the thing is, as believers, we need to know how to address things like this, because it's happening very widespread. Over 80% of the people who are dying, if you interview them daily, they report experiences like this. Very interesting.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So I think this kind of brings us into that natural next question of why should we consider people's personal experience as a reliable form of evidence?
Okay. Yeah, that's a big question. So many people, I was teaching a seminar on this, and one of my colleagues just said, well, I think we all know that eyewitness testimony is just some of the worst kind of testimony. That's just the worst kind of evidence. And what I wanted to say, I didn't want to put down a colleague, but I wanted to say, well, how did you find out about this seminar? Well, obviously, he read an email or saw a poster, and he believed what the person said. In other words, he trusted personal testimony. Every day, we're deciding whether testimony is reliable or unreliable and making decisions on it. In fact, if we took away personal testimony as evidence, our whole legal system would come to ruins, because that's exactly why you have a court case and you have eyewitnesses saying, I heard the person say that he was going to kill so-and-so, and that becomes a part of the evidence. So anyone studying forensic medicine, forensic science, that's a science, a part of what they study is how do you assess testimonies. So to say we don't believe it, in fact, all scientists, most of what they believe is not because of their personal experiments. They're believing what other scientists have said they've done the research on, or what they've read in a peer-reviewed journal that this science, they haven't replicated that. They believe them. Why do they believe it? Well, they think if you have trustworthy people doing the research, if you have people overseeing it, in other words, there's more than one person who's doing this, they have methods by which we can determine good testimony from bad. So that's exactly what we're doing with near-death and deathbed experiences, is we're saying, do we have good reason to believe this person? Sometimes, is there more than one person having the experience, like in a shared death experience? If so, that can be pretty darn good evidence. And we use it all the time. We just need to learn how to use it better. And whenever we're doing research or talking about such experiences as this, we need to clarify why we think that there's good evidence I should believe this person.
So what do you think is the criteria that you're using to determine good testimony, bad testimony? I mean, at the end of the day, right, with near-death experiences, it's all subjective to that person themselves. And so what is the criteria we use to determine reliable testimony, unreliable testimony?
Well, there's several things we can use. Number one, did I interview the person personally, or did I read this in the Huffington Post, which got it from somebody's blog and it's several people removed? If I'm getting in a court case, that would be considered hearsay. They wouldn't accept that as evidence probably. They're going to say, no, this needs to be something that you've actually heard and seen happen. Direct testimony, eyewitness testimony is the best. So when I'm talking to a person who's had a near-death experience, that's their personal testimony of what they've had. That's going to be better than just interviewing doctors and nurses about what they've seen in these type experiences. And that's what we try to do, is to go straight to the people themselves. Another thing is you have to decide whether the person has mental issues. Do they have mental illness? And so most of the people doing this research screen from that for that. If they're talking to somebody in a hospice, do they have evidence of mental illness? Have they had it in the past? You want to screen those out. But also, okay, think about a court of law. If a person is testifying against a drug kingpin, you tend to accept that testimony because they don't have a good reason for lying about that drug. In fact, that potentially hurts them by giving that testimony. Well, that's considered very reliable testimony. Also, deathbed testimony is considered it's kind of an exceptional type of testimony, because they think, why would somebody try to get in just their last lie right before they died? Just doesn't seem reasonable. So when people tell about their near-death experiences, why would that be considered good testimony? Well, from a forensic standpoint, number one, they're afraid to share about these experiences because they're afraid people will think they're crazy and will send them to the psychiatric ward if they start talking about it. So they've got lots of reasons. We know from interviewing thousands of people that researchers have done that they're extremely hesitant to share these experiences with anybody for fear of looking stupid or being thought crazy. So they have lots of reasons to not share it. If somebody's writing a book on their personal experience, I tend to question them because there may be a money motive or whatever. But if they're just sharing with their physician or with someone doing research, then you just don't see a good reason for them to be lying. And if they were lying, why would it be that all these people's testimonies converge into a very similar experience, even between countries? You'd have to almost believe in some kind of huge conspiracy theory in order to believe that they got together and said, okay, here's what we're going to say happened. If they were lying, this stuff would be all over the board, but it's
Well,
very
and
consistent.
their fear is not ungrounded, right? Because when they do come to, they're telling their doctor or their nurse about what they experience, and then the doctor or the nurse is just going to be like, "Oh, well, you were just, you were on the brink of death. This is just a weird experience. That's interesting." Like they show a high level of disinterest, and this person just had this crazy, real beyond real experience, and now that's just getting shrugged off, and so that fear that they have is not ungrounded. It's that most of these people come back and they tend to share right away with a nurse or a doctor, the first person they see, and then that person tends to undermine the idea entirely, and then that causes a person to be like, well, I guess I can't really talk about it because I might have something to lose. But years and years and years later, which I think adds to the validity of the testimony, they can't shake how real it felt and what they went through, and how much this experience changed them. And so that's what kind of prompts them to want to write about it and talk about it. And so that kind of leads us into why near-death experiences are becoming a more reliable form of evidence, and they need to be included in the apologetics conversation, is because of how much research
Hmm.
began in the 70s and then how it's kind of accumulated over time, now to the point where we can establish common elements on what people are experiencing within their near-death experiences. We have a common set of elements that many researchers have found among them. Now, the details themselves would differ, but that's something that you typically see referencing to forensic questioning. They're not looking for stories to match exactly. They're looking at stories to see, do these stories have similar elements? Although the people might be describing something they saw differently or notice a different particular detail than someone else might have noticed in that particular situation, there's still similar elements in the way that they're describing the situation that they were in.
And an important distinction to make is, even though some of the elements differ, I don't see them as contradictory if you're looking at the
Right.
main experience. Just because one person happens to see their deceased pet on the other side, and another one their deceased uncle, and another one doesn't see a deceased person at all, they just talk to an angel and come back, and another one has a life review with the being of light. Those don't contradict each other. It's just
Right.
that they do have different elements, and you can, but it's a similar amount of 11 or so elements that you tend to see in all these experiences, which is
Well,
totally unexpected if it's just like a hallucination.
yeah, and you mentioned the being of light, and that's a perfect example of how people interpret that differently. Everyone's encountering this being of light, but some people think it's, if they come from an Islamic background, they think it's the Islamic God. If they come from a Hindu background, they think it's the Hindu ultimate God. People interpret this experience through the information that they have. It's just kind of like you watch these old movie or a sci-fi movie, right? And you see these indigenous cultures encounter a spaceship, and then they call it the flying pyramid or the flying rock, right? It's obviously not a flying pyramid or flying rock. It's just that's the closest thing they have to describe it. And so in the same sense, people in their respective cultures and their respective belief systems are just trying to interpret this experience to the information, the lens in which they're viewing the experience, and trying to relate it to other people. Now, you might be like, oh, well, this person said that they saw their God, and this person said that they saw their God. It's like, we're not necessarily concerned with how they described him. We're more so concerned with the actual tangible things that we can pull out of that experience, not the descriptors, such as the being of light, for example.
Well, I would say to correct a little bit, I would say they tend to be describing that being in the same way.
I see. Yeah.
They may name it something different depending on their culture. Like a person in the United States, when they, with a strong Christian flavoring on the culture, when we see someone on the other side that we deem to be a messenger of God, we call it an angel.
Mhm.
But in another culture, like in India, they might call it a different name depending on what they happen to call such a being. But I think they're seeing the same beings. They just have different names that, of course, they use because of their culture.
Hmm. So where do you see the near-death experience research continuing forward? Kind of where do you see it potentially going in the future?
Well, I think it's just getting more and more legitimate in mainstream science. For example, um, one of the reasons that it's become important is in nursing literature and people that are working directly with the dying. So, hospice, for example, It's very relevant for them to study people who are dying for deathbed experiences and to interpret things like near-death experiences, because that involves their care of a patient. When somebody starts talking about having seen something on the other side, do you adjust the morphine? Do you just kind of try to bring them back to reality? This is a very practical problem. So this is one reason it's been studied. They're not all looking for evidence for the afterlife. They're looking for how to treat a patient. So this continues to be studied, and this now is in a lot of the nursing literature. And I think the people who are studying this are saying, we need to get more of this in what doctors and nurses are studying in their textbooks, because there's no question the experience happens. The question is, how do you respond to a patient when they report these things? Well, we need to say that, number one, and this is what I hear them consistently saying, number one, it's not really a hallucination, okay? It's not, it very much differs from hallucinations. We've shown that in a lot of different studies. It doesn't seem to be connected to a lack of oxygen or too much oxygen, or, it seems to be because some of these patients, they're actually tracking oxygen levels while it was going on. So don't call it a hallucination. It seems to be something spiritual, and they're very comfortable using the word spirituality. And so typically they'll say, talk to the patient, ask them, encourage them to share, because they need somebody to share it with. And often these patients need to deal with something at the end of life, or because of their near-death experience as a result, which means that counselors need to be understanding this. So you're near death and you're seeing some relatives on the other side. Well, maybe you're needing to deal with some forgiveness issues or something down here on earth even. Maybe you never got along with your mom, and now you've just seen your mom on the other side. Maybe you need to kind of deal with some things before you go. I think that sometimes God is giving someone an experience, giving them a last chance to deal with some spiritual matters before they go to the other side. And so we need to be talking to them. So why is it getting more professional? Because it's extremely relevant to the medical field, and because so much has been done. I just see it snowballing now to where even in something that's sponsored by the Academy of Sciences or whatever, there will be top physicians, top people that are, in resuscitation or whatever the fields are, discussing these things very openly. Where in the first, you just kind of had Moody doing it, and he had a degree in medicine. He had a degree in philosophy as well, but this was just kind of a little niche thing. Now it's just everywhere, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles in the peer-reviewed medical journals.
And so you're saying that the medical field is starting to develop kind of a debriefing process for these people that might also begin documentation of it from hospitals all over the world.
Yes, we're seeing more and more documented studies of this, and they're coming up with consolidating how do you talk to these people as a nurse or as a doctor who's had these experiences. And we're seeing it emerge like in nursing textbooks and just consolidations of the work done so far. So it just continues to move forward. Typically, the critics that I hear that are just saying, oh, it's only hallucinations, it's this and that.
Yeah, what do you think?
The ones that I read, that they've not even studied the evidence. They're coming with a priori presupposition of naturalism, and then they just say, well, this can't be true, and so it's obviously some type of hallucination. But I just don't see hardly any of these people, like Shermer and others who are writing books against the afterlife. I don't see any evidence that they've actually studied near-death experiences or deathbed experiences.
Yeah.
They just come up with statements saying, oh, well, this is obviously what it is. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, what about all these studies that have been done that have shown that it's not a hallucination or it's not consistent with hallucinations?
Or that the brain was dead during the experience, like with Eben Alexander's experience. You don't have a brain to do the computing necessary to create this hallucination, to create this experience that you're trying to attribute to the brain just kind of going haywire. So with that being said, Dr. Miller, what are the top 3 natural objections that you hear, naturalist based objections that you hear, and let's steelman it. Let's make sure that we get the strongest form of this objection out there. And what is your response to those objections?
Well, like physicist Sean Carroll, very outspoken atheist, he would say they're just people hallucinate before they die. He'd say it's just really obvious. But the hallucination theory, if you look at like Penny Sartori in Europe, did a study for her dissertation in in an emergency room situation, and so she cataloged not only near-death experiences, but people who had hallucinations. And some people would have both. They would have a hallucination, then they'd have a near-death experience. But she said these are just entirely different. And when you look at examples of them, you'll say, oh, hallucinations are really bizarre. You've got weird insects getting on you, doing things, just all kind of weird, bizarre stuff. Random, extreme variety. And then you look at a near-death experience and it's coherent, it's similar all the way across cultures. Why would that be? It just, they've pretty much, the people who have studied this have ruled out hallucinations as an explanation. Then some will say, oh, well, it's hypoxia or anoxia, either a lack of oxygen to the brain or too much oxygen to the brain. Well, okay, but they've studied some people where you look at their records and you see they were tracking the oxygen levels and they seem to be fine. So how could that be an explanation? Plus, they will say, hey, this is kind of like a person who's up in a airplane high, a jet high in the air, and they have this experience where they lack oxygen. But when you actually look at what they were experiencing, these are very, very different from near-death experiences. So plus all these naturalistic explanations seem to make a little sense until you compare it, what happens in a natural situation to a near-death experience. Very different. But also it doesn't take into account all the seemingly supernatural things that are happening, things beyond the natural. And that's what, as I mentioned, I believe in the last interview, Sawbohm was saying, as a cardiologist, he didn't really think he thought they were just hallucinations or dreams or whatever. And then he studied his patients and he found that the ones who had a near-death experience, their description of the resuscitation process that they specifically went through went along with their records. The people who did not have a near-death experience, when he asked them, okay, what do you think your resuscitation was like? They consistently got it wrong.
Right. They described it like a medical show.
So this is evidence that these people over here that had a near-death experience were actually observing from outside of their bodies. And you've got corroboration from the medical records seeing what actually happened. So, and how do the blind people report seeing when they're on the other side, when they've never seen before? The realism of it. I think some people need to take their philosophical pipe and smoke a little on their back deck, thinking about, and I don't smoke, I'm speaking metaphorically,
Yeah,
literalist out there. But
yeah, I got
what
that.
does it mean that this person says, I was there, it was real? And yet some people will say it's just dreams. These are just dreams. No. Every one of these will say, I've never had a dream like this. I was there. Let me just give you an example. And one way to bring the evidence down, which I would encourage everyone to do, and this is good with evaluating testimony. If these experiences are as widespread as they say, 4% of the population saying that they've had near-death experiences, over 80% of the population that's dying saying that they've had deathbed experiences. If that much of the population has experienced these things, then it's widespread, which means you don't just have to read the research out there. You can get in a family gathering of 25 people, odds are one of them has had a near-death experience, right? 4%. Am I thinking right here? 25 people, one of them may have had one. So I'll give you 2 examples that stopped me if I said this in my last interview, but I don't think I did. So I was starting to study near-death experiences, and I had a relative come over, Bucky, and he said he teaches history, has a master's degree, and he tells me about his experience. My mother said, "Hey, Steve, tell him what you're writing about." I said, "I'm writing about near-death experiences." He says, "Oh, I've had 3 of those." And I said, "Are you
Whoa.
serious?" And I mean, this is a guy that I'd go to family gatherings with, very level-headed fella, smart guy. But also I'd never heard him talk about the experience. Why? People don't talk about it in general. They're afraid people will think they're crazy. But since I'm studying it, he says, "Oh, okay, let me tell you about it." So I was laying in bed one night sleeping. All of a sudden, I felt like a huge weight had hit my chest. My body, my spirit came out of my body. I could see a tunnel up in the corner of the room. I looked down and could see my body. Then I went back down into my body, woke up in just a cold sweat, and the phone rang, and I answered it, and they said my dad, who I thought was perfectly healthy, said he had had a health checkup recently, had just died of a heart attack in a hospital. And that's called a shared death experience. So when you say, "Oh, well, it was just a hallucination," well, wait a minute. Hallucinations don't tell you about something that's happening at the same moment several hours away that you had no expectation of.
Were you able to verify his father passing at that time?
I didn't go back just because and verify it just because I trust Bucky. I've kind of grown up going to get-togethers with him. He's not a bearer of tall tales. I could do that. That would be cool to see what was the
Yeah,
date that he died and verify it. And the good
it'd be
researchers
interesting.
do that. They'll go back and say, "Okay, now he said his wife was there. Let me go talk to his wife and see what she says." And also in Sidgwick and a lot of these in the late 1800s that were studying deathbed experiences very broadly, they would go get newspaper reports of the person's death and say, "Oh yeah, it did happen at this time." Some people had written it down when they had a vision, and they wouldn't find out till the next day that the person had died in another continent. So do that. Another person I talked to in my church, my pastor said, "Oh, if you're studying that, you need to talk to this person." And he was a minister of men in the church. Said he doesn't tell anybody about this, but he'd probably talk to you since you're studying it. So sure enough, I went to him. He had been through a situation in recent years to where his body was shutting down due to some septic toxic something going on in his blood. He was like almost comatose. And during that time, he met with, I believe it was 3 angelic beings who told him, they had this discussion as to whether it was his time to go or not. And they taught and said, "Well, no, you need to go ahead and keep living, for this reason or that." And so he said, "I'm laying there. I can't even talk. I see my wife and everybody's all sad. They don't know what's happening, whether they think I'm going to die." And I'm thinking, I'm not going to die. I already know it. I just got this word. Now I talked to him and I said, "Okay, what degree of reality was it?" And I asked him this in several different ways. When you saw it, I mean, was this kind of like a dream or a vivid dream? He said, "No, it was real." And he looked at me and he said, he said, it was realer than real. In fact, it's just as real as me sitting here talking to you across the table. It was more real than that. And I thought, well, okay, here's a person I trust. He has no reason to be lying to me about these things. He doesn't tell it in his ministry because he's afraid people will think he's crazy. And he's telling, and I think, how do I know that we're awake now having this interview rather than dreaming? Because of the degree of reality is
Right.
more real than a dream.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they know that it's real? Well, this is at least as real, maybe more real, some will say. It's not like a vivid dream at all. And to me, that has evidential value. In other words, if this many people are having these hyper-realistic experiences, and they're all saying, yes, I was there on the other side, then even if I don't trust other people's testimonies, could I trust my testimony about my future self? My future self, if it has an experience like this, is going to look back and say, yes, that I was real on the other side. So I just wonder, with Shermer and all these guys who are skeptics, would they trust their future selves' testimony, saying that if it happens to you, you're going to say it was real? There's something to that, and I'd like people to kind of think on that, light up their spiritual pipe and smoke on it a while and see if that's going somewhere with you.
Put that in your pipe and smoke it, right?
There you go.
Okay, awesome. Well, excellent. I think that is a lot of really good thoughts for everyone to take home and think about. Did you want to close with anything else, Dr. Miller?
I'd just say this isn't just a head trip. For me, I've been through doubts and questions at different points in my life, like some of you do. You have a relative die and you question the goodness of God and these things. To me, my study of deathbed and near-death experiences, although I've never had one personally, number one, it strengthened my faith that, hey, there is an afterlife. There is a God. God is good, even though many things bad happen on this earth. Nobody has a near-death or deathbed experience and comes back saying God is evil. They all say it was the biggest experience with love that I've ever had. Nobody comes back that I've read and says God is unjust. They say, now, I don't understand. I can't tell you here on earth why it all makes sense, but I can tell you when you go to the other side, it all makes sense. And God is just. God is love. And
what about, sorry to interrupt. I am curious to say this, though. What about distressing near-death experiences?
Well, they don't come back saying that God is evil. They come back typically from a place where God is absent, and they are in some type of torment. I think they've been given this experience as a warning, as something to say, and just as the people who have a good experience, they don't understand all the theology involved, but they're motivated to seek, they're motivated to read their Bibles, to talk to other people, to go to church and find out what's going on. They're motivated to seek and put it all together, which I believe is God's mode of operation. He wants the gospel to be passed through the Bible, through people who are preaching the word, by people who are one-on-one, rather than giving them the whole package in an experience like this. That's what happened to the Apostle Paul. But let me mention this. One thing, I have claustrophobia. The thought of not being able to move really freaks me out. I would have made a great wrestler because nobody could have held me down for long. The adrenaline would have pumped and they would have been off like a superhero. But that's always made me fear dying, because I think if I get in one of those situations where I can't move, it just freaks me out. I think one thing that this study of near-death and deathbed experiences has helped me with is, in deathbed experiences, it seems like God is giving people a vision of the other side often before they even go there. So that if I'm in a bad situation here, He's ministering to me. In the valley of the shadow of death, God's ministering to me, helping me to not have to fully experience the impact of such a horrible time at life. And so to me, study of near-death and deathbed experiences has just helped me to love God more, seek Him more, and trust Him more with my life. And I think that's what I'd want to end with.
Excellent. Well, I think that that's a great stopping point as well. So thank you, everybody, for turning out today for Pondering Christianity's episode with Dr. Miller. Again, if you guys have follow-up questions that you would like us to address in another interview, go ahead and place them in the comment section below of this video. And in the meantime, you know what I'm saying? It's just Put it in your pipe and smoke it and keep on pondering.
Go for it.